A very good morning to one and all present here. I am Rakhi Olak from DAV Pushpanjali. Today, in class 11th English, we shall discuss the chapter The Portrait of a Lady by Khushwant Singh. The Portrait of a Lady is a beautiful, heartwarming story of a loving relationship between the writer and his grandmother. It is a vivid description of their attachment to each other, which withstood all the changes in time and values. Before we proceed, let us have a quick look at the biosketch of the author. Khushwant Singh, one of the best known Indian writers of all times, was born in 1915 in Hadali. He was the founder editor of Yojana, editor of the Illustrated Weekly of India, the National Herald, and Hindustan Times. As a writer, he was best known for his humor, sarcasm, and an abiding love of poetry. His comparisons of social and behavior characteristics of Westerners and Indians are laced with acid wit. He served as the editor of several literary and news magazines, as well as two newspapers. He was also the Member of Parliament in Rajya Sabha and the Upper House of Parliament of India. Khushwant Singh was bestowed with Padma Bhushan in 1974. However, he returned the award when the Indian Army raided Amritsar in Operation Blue Star. In 2007, he was awarded the Padma Vibhushan, second highest civilian award in India. He passed away in 2014 at the age of 99. The Portrait of a Lady highlights his distinct, awe inspiring skill of storytelling. It is especially very relevant in today's mechanical city life where the gadget loving generation doesn't have time for the heart to heart conversation with their grandparents. There is a wide gap between these two generations. The youngsters don't want to hear their age old stories anymore. The story also paints a picture of rural India and the varying views of the West. Dear students, you can read your Hornbill textbook page number 3 or browse through the e-book available on the NCERT portal as we see the word meanings of the paragraphs on the screen with explanations here. As the story begins, the author talks about his grandmother. He had known her for the past 20 years and she had always been old and wrinkled. He was told that she was once young and pretty and had a husband. His grandfather's portrait hung on the wall, in which he wore loose fitting clothes, a turban, and had a long white beard that reached his chest. He also appeared very old, and the author thought that he was someone who could have many grandchildren but not a wife or children. The author could never imagine that once his grandmother was young and pretty. He could not connect to this idea. She used to tell him about her childhood memories, like the games she used to play as a child. He found these stories illogical because it was beyond his imagination to think that his grandmother was once a child and played such games. He thought that her life stories were just like other moral stories she used to tell him. His grandmother was short, fat, slightly bent in posture, and her face had a lot of wrinkles. She seemed so old, and she had been the same for the past 20 years, that according to the author, she was beautiful but not pretty. She walked in the house in an awkward way, wearing spotless white clothes, with beads of rosary hanging from one hand and the other hand rested on her back for support. She had silver hair. She was constantly chanting prayers. He compares her to the winter landscape in the mountains which has a peaceful and calm feel. She was a live example of a pure, white, peace emitting entity. The author lived with her in the village. They were very good friends. His parents left him with her to settle in the city. The author's grandmother used to wake him up every morning and get him ready for school. She would recite her morning prayers while she bathed and dressed him up, and he loved her voice, but he would not try to memorize the word of what she spoke. She would make his things ready, like wooden slate, a tiny earthen ink pot, and a red pen. He would eat a thick stale chapati with butter and sugar spread on it. They both used to walk to school, and his grandmother carried stale chapatis with her to feed the village dogs. Paragraph 4 tells us that his grandmother would accompany him to the school as the temple was attached to the school, and she used to visit the temple daily. On one side, he would sit on the veranda with the other children, would sing the alphabets and prayer in chorus. On the other, she would sit in the temple to read the scriptures. After finishing, they would walk back home together. The village dogs met them at the village door. The dogs would follow them to their home, growling and fighting with each other for the stale chapatis that she fed them. His parents got settled in the city and then they called them. That was the turning point of his friendship with his grandmother. They shared the same room, but she was no longer able to give him company to his school. He started going to an English medium school, and the motor bus would come to pick up and drop him. There were no dogs in the streets whom she could now feed as she did in the village. So she started feeding sparrows in the veranda of their house. As the years passed in the city, their interaction reduced. For some time, she continued to wake him up and would get him ready for school. She would ask him what he had learnt in the school. The scientific terminology and English words made her unhappy. As she didn't know the language, she could not help him with his lessons. As his new school never taught him about God and religious scriptures, this made the grandmother very sad. She did not approve of such an education. When she came to know that he was getting music lessons, it disturbed her. According to her, music was very indecent and it was the art for the beggars and prostitutes, and not for those belonging to decent families. She did not like that he learned music, so she stopped talking to him. As years passed, in the city, their interaction reduced. For some time, she continued to wake him up and would get him ready for school, but not later on anymore. As the author went to the university, he had the room of his own. The common link of his friendship with his grandmother that they had when they shared the same room was changed now, and thus his friendship with her ended. She became more private and spent her whole day spinning wheel. From sunrise to sunset, she would sit and silently recite her prayers. In the afternoon, she used to feed sparrows in the veranda. Breaking the bread into small pieces, she would feed hundreds of birds. The birds would gather around her. Some sat near her, some on her legs, some on her shoulders, and few on her head. She never shooed them, but always smiled. It was the happiest half an hour for her in the whole day. When the author decided to go abroad for further studies, he believed it would be the last time he would see her, as he would be gone for 5 long years. As they all reached the station, she held him tightly and kissed his forehead. He thought that it was their last physical contact. The wet impression of her hand was dear to him. She was not sentimental at all. When he came back after 5 years, she came to meet him at the station. She looked just the way she did 5 years ago, not a day older. She held him again in her arms and was still reciting her prayers. He noticed on the first day of his arrival that only sparrows would make her happy. In the evening, she didn't follow her regular routine of praying. She collected a few women from the neighborhood and got a drum and started singing with them. She thumped the drum and sang along. The whole family persuaded her to stop as she might get ill due to exhaustion. The next morning she was ill. It was mild fever. The doctors told them that it would go away, but she took it differently. According to her, she believed that she would die, that her end was near. She started chanting prayers as she didn't want to waste her last hours talking to anyone. The family protested. They tried to stop her, but she lay peacefully on her bed, chanting prayers and telling her beads. Suddenly, she stopped, and the rosary fell from her lifeless fingers. A calm, pale appearance spread on her face, and she was dead. The family lifted her from the bed, laid her on the ground, and wrapped her in the red colored cloth. Thousands of sparrows sat silently near her. The author's mother fetched some bread for the birds, but they didn't eat any. They flew away later as the family carried the dead body for cremation. The sweeper removed the crumbs the next morning. The birds were so sensitive. They did not want to eat bread, but were mourning the death of the one who had fed them for so many years. Dear students, the key points of the chapter are given hereby on the screen. They will navigate your reading for a better comprehension. Read the chapter once again very carefully. Browse through the glossary provided here before you attempt the questions of the assignments. Wish you all a very happy reading. Thank you for your patient listening.